If Adam and Eve were the first humans and they only had sons named Cain and Abel, then who exactly did Cain marry? This question has puzzled believers and skeptics alike for thousands of years, and today we're going to uncover the shocking truth that most people have never heard. What you're about to discover will completely change how you understand the earliest chapters of human history, and it involves forbidden knowledge that's been hiding in plain sight this entire time. But before we dive in, if you're new to this channel, consider hitting that like and subscribe button if you haven't already. Your support means continue producing these videos to help you learn more or unwind. Also, let us know where you're watching from and what time it is. We're building a community here so you can meet like-minded people from around the world and connect in the comment section down below. So without further ado, let's get started, shall we? The Genesis Enigma, posing the famous question. In the beginning, there was a garden. Two people walked beneath its trees, tasted its fruit, and knew no other humans besides themselves. The story unfolds with a simplicity that masks its depth. Adam and Eve, the first man and woman, bring children into a world still fresh and new. Their firstborn son arrives with joy. Eve names him Cain, declaring she has brought forth a man with the help of the Lord. Soon after, a second son follows. Abel becomes a keeper of flocks, while Cain works the soil, each brother carving out his place in this young world. The brothers bring offerings to God. Abel selects the finest of his flock, the fat portions of the firstborn. Cain gathers fruit from his harvest, produced from the ground he tends. God looks with favor on Abel and his gift. But Cain's offering receives no such regard. The text gives no reason why. One gift finds acceptance, the other does not. Anger rises in Cain's heart. His face falls. God speaks to him, warning that sin crouches at his door like a beast waiting to pounce. Master it, God tells him. But Cain does not master it. Out in the field, away from watchful eyes, Cain rises against his brother. Abel's blood soaks into the earth, crying out from the ground itself. God confronts Cain with a question, "Where is your brother?" Cain responds with words that echo through millennia, "Am I my brother's keeper?" But the ground has already testified. The soil that received Abel's blood now refuses to yield its strength to Cain. A curse falls upon him. He will wander the earth as a fugitive, a restless wanderer with no place to call home. Cain protests that his punishment exceeds what he can bear. Anyone who finds him will end his life. God places a mark upon him, a sign of protection, ensuring that vengeance will not overtake him. 7 times over, God promises anyone who harms Cain will face retribution. Then Cain leaves. He goes out from the Lord's presence, traveling to a land called Nod, east of Eden. The name itself means wandering. Here, in this place of exile, something remarkable happens, something that has puzzled readers for thousands of years. Cain knew his wife. The text states it plainly, without ceremony or explanation. She conceived and bore him a son named Enoch. Cain built a city and named it after his son, establishing a home in the land of his wandering. But wait. Stop and consider what the narrative has shown us. Adam and Eve, the first humans, their 2 sons, Cain and Abel. One brother now gone, his blood in the ground. One brother exiled alone in a distant land. And yet suddenly, Cain has a wife. She appears in the text without introduction, without ancestry, without origin. Who was she? Where did she come from? The question hangs in the air, demanding an answer. At first glance, the world seems empty save for 3 people, Adam, Eve, and their exiled son. Abel rests in the earth. No other names appear in the story up to this point. No other families receive mention. Yet Cain finds a wife in Nod, a woman who bears his children and helps him build a civilization. The mystery deepens when we consider Cain's own words to God. After receiving his curse, he cries out that anyone who finds him might take his life. Anyone. The word suggests others exist, people beyond his immediate family who might encounter him in his wandering. Who are these potential seekers? Who populates this world that still seems, by the narrative's account, nearly empty? For centuries, this question has sparked debate among scholars, theologians, and curious readers. Some dismiss it as a minor detail, unworthy of attention. Others see it as a crack in the foundation, a problem that threatens the entire structure of biblical truth. Still others view it as an invitation, a puzzle piece that reveals something profound about the nature of the text itself. The question touches more than curiosity about an ancient marriage. It reaches into deeper waters. How do we read these old stories? What do they tell us about human origins, about family, about the nature of sin and consequence? The wife of Cain becomes a doorway into larger rooms, each one holding its own questions and revelations. Consider the implications. If Cain married someone from outside his family, it suggests other human populations existed alongside Adam's line. This possibility raises theological questions that ripple forward through the entire biblical narrative. Were Adam and Eve truly the first humans, or were they the first of a particular line chosen and set apart? Does the story intend to describe all humanity, or only the ancestry of one people group? On the other hand, if Cain married within his family, the answer creates its own set of questions. Modern readers recoil at the thought of such close unions. Our laws forbid them. Our biology warns against them. Yet the text presents no concern, no divine prohibition, no sense that anything improper has occurred. Why the silence? What are we missing? The Genesis account moves forward without pause. After mentioning Cain's wife, the narrative traces his descendants. Enoch has a son, Irad. Irad fathers Mehujael. The generations continue, building cities, crafting tools of bronze and iron, creating music with harp and flute. Civilization emerges from this exiled line, complete with technology, art, and culture. Meanwhile, back with Adam and Eve, the story notes that they have another son, Seth, given as a replacement for Abel. Through Seth's line, the genealogy continues, eventually leading to Noah and beyond. But between Abel's death and Seth's birth, how much time passes? The text does not say. And what of other children born during those silent years? The narrative leaves room for possibilities, for lives lived between the verses. This is where we begin, with a question that seems simple on its surface, but opens into depths we have yet to explore. The wife of Cain stands as one of the Bible's most famous mysteries, a woman without a name, without a backstory, yet crucial to the continuation of human history as the text presents it. The answer, when we find it, will require us to read carefully, think deeply, and hold multiple truths at once. We will need to understand ancient perspectives while addressing modern concerns. We will trace genealogies, examine cultural contexts, and consider scientific evidence. We will explore theories that range from straightforward to speculative. But first, we must understand exactly what the text says and, just as importantly, what it does not say. The Bible provides clues scattered across several chapters, waiting for careful readers to gather them together. The question of Cain's wife cannot be answered from a single verse. The solution requires us to step back, view the larger landscape of Genesis, and see how the pieces fit together. The mystery begins here, in the land of Nod, with a man and his unnamed wife. But the answer will take us much further, back to the beginning and forward through generations, until we see the full picture that Genesis paints of humanity's earliest days. Reading the text, what Genesis actually says and doesn't say. The answer to our question hides in plain sight, scattered across the opening chapters of Genesis. But finding it requires reading with care, noticing details that casual readers often miss. The text provides clues, but they come in fragments, spread across different passages and embedded in genealogies that modern readers tend to skip. Start with Genesis chapter 1. Let us make mankind in our image, God declares. The words carry weight beyond their surface meaning. Mankind, not a man. The Hebrew word is Adam, which can mean both a proper name and humanity in general. God creates mankind, male and female, blessing them together. Be fruitful and multiply, the command goes out. Fill the earth and subdue it. This first chapter presents creation in broad strokes, painting with a wide brush. The pattern repeats, evening and morning, day after day. Light and dark, sea and sky, plants and animals, all coming into being through divine speech. Humanity arrives on the sixth day, created in God's image, given dominion over all living things. The chapter ends with God surveying everything made and declaring it very good. Then comes chapter 2, and the perspective shifts. The lens zooms in. Now we see creation through a narrower frame, focusing specifically on the garden and its first inhabitants. The Lord God forms the man from dust, breathing life into his nostrils. He plants a garden in Eden, placing the man there to work and keep it. Trees spring up, pleasing to the eye and good for food. A river flows out, watering the garden before dividing into 4 headwaters. The animals parade before the man as he names them. Yet among all these creatures, no suitable helper appears. God brings deep sleep upon the man, takes one of his ribs, and fashions a woman. The man wakes and recognizes her, bone of his bone, flesh of his flesh. She shall be called woman because she was taken out of man. Therefore, a man leaves his father and mother and holds fast to his wife. These two chapters work differently. Genesis 1 offers a systematic, orderly account. Genesis 2 provides intimate detail, focusing on relationship and purpose. Scholars note the distinct literary styles, the different names for God, the varying emphasis. Rather than contradiction, these chapters complement each other, showing the same events from different angles. After the garden, after the fruit and the serpent and the exile, comes the notice of children. Cain arrives first, then Abel. The narrative records their occupations, their offerings, the tragic outcome. Cain goes to Nod. Then, as we have seen, he finds a wife. But here's what most readers miss. The text has not yet finished describing Adam's family. Chapter 4 tells us about Cain's descendants, tracing his line through several generations. Then in chapter 5, the narrative returns to Adam and begins again. This is the book of the generations of Adam, the chapter announces. When God created man, he made him in the likeness of God. Male and female he created them, blessing them and naming them mankind when they were created. Adam lived 130 years and fathered Seth. After Seth's birth, Adam lived another 800 years. And then comes the detail that changes everything, and had other sons and daughters. There it is, stated plainly without fanfare. Adam and Eve had other children beyond Cain, Abel, and Seth. The text does not name them. It does not number them. It simply notes their existence and moves on. But this single phrase opens the door to understanding Cain's wife. Genesis 5 continues this pattern with each generation. Seth lived, fathered Enosh, then had other sons and daughters. Enosh lived, fathered Canaan, then had other sons and daughters. The pattern repeats through the genealogy. Each named patriarch represents a line being traced, but around him exists a larger family tree with branches spreading in multiple directions. The lifespans recorded in Genesis 5 stagger the modern mind. Adam lives 930 years. Seth reaches 912. Enosh makes it to 905. These extended lifespans mean overlapping generations, family trees that grow exponentially over centuries. If Adam and Eve had children for even a fraction of Adam's life, and if those children also lived for centuries and bore their own children, the population would expand rapidly. Consider the mathematics. If Adam and Eve had 6 children, and each of those 6 had 6 children, and those 36 each had 6 children, within just 3 generations, we reach over 200 people. Extend this across centuries, with lifespans allowing for many more children per couple, and the numbers grow exponentially. By the time Cain reaches Nod, the world could hold thousands of descendants from Adam and Eve. The text also hints at the passage of time in ways easy to overlook. Between Abel's death and Seth's birth, Genesis notes that Adam was 130 years old when Seth arrived, but it does not tell us how old Adam was when Cain was born. Years, perhaps decades, could have passed between the garden exile and the brothers' confrontation. More time might have elapsed between Abel's death and Cain's journey to Nod. During these unspecified periods, other children would have been born, grown, and started families of their own. Genesis also mentions that Cain built a city. Cities require populations. A city is not 2 or 3 dwellings, but a community of people, organized and settled. Who populated this city? The text gives us Cain's descendants, but a city suggests a broader population base. These people had to come from somewhere. The genealogies themselves serve a specific purpose. Ancient readers understood that genealogies often compress generations, highlighting key figures while passing over others. The goal was not comprehensive family records, but tracing specific lines of descent. Genesis follows certain branches of the family tree, while acknowledging that other branches existed. Look at the structure of these opening chapters. Chapter 4 traces Cain's line through Lamech, showing the development of culture, technology, and city life among his descendants. Then chapter 5 returns to Adam and traces a different line through Seth, leading eventually to Noah. 2 family lines, 2 trajectories, both emerging from the same source. The Table of Nations in Genesis 10, appearing after the flood, follows a similar pattern. It traces the descendants of Noah's 3 sons, showing how they spread across the earth and formed different peoples. Again, the genealogy selects specific names while acknowledging a broader population. The point is not exhaustive detail, but showing connection and continuity. What Genesis does not say proves as important as what it does say. The text never claims that Cain, Abel, and Seth were the only children born to Adam and Eve. It never suggests the world remained empty except for this one family. It never expresses concern about Cain finding a wife or building a city. These events simply happen, recorded without commentary. The silence speaks volumes. If Cain's wife posed a problem in the eyes of the original audience, we would expect some explanation, some justification. Instead, the narrative flows smoothly over the detail, suggesting that ancient readers understood something modern readers need to rediscover. The text also remains silent on certain prohibitions that would later become law. Leviticus 18, written much later, forbids marriages between close relatives. Brother and sister, parent and child, aunt and nephew, these unions become forbidden. But in Genesis, before Moses, before the law, such regulations do not exist. The text records marriages without commenting on their propriety. This silence does not mean anything goes. Rather, it suggests that the rules governing later societies did not apply to these earliest generations. What became forbidden later was perhaps necessary earlier. The text trusts its readers to understand the difference between prescription and description, and between recording what happened and endorsing it as a permanent pattern. Genesis also includes the phrase, "and he died after each patriarch" in chapter 5. The pattern emphasizes mortality, the consequence of the garden exile working its way through every generation. But before death comes life, years of life, centuries in fact. And during those centuries, children are born, families expand, and humanity fills the earth as commanded. The clues sit there in the text, waiting for readers to connect them. Other sons and daughters. Extended lifespans, compressed genealogies, cities being built. Time passing unmarked between verses. Each detail contributes to the answer, but only when we step back and see the larger picture. The Bible does not give us a verse that says Cain married his sister or Cain married a daughter of Adam and Eve. It does not need to. The information is present in the structure, in the genealogies, in the patterns of ancient storytelling. The original audience would have understood. They knew how genealogies worked. They recognized that naming 3 sons did not exclude the existence of others. Modern readers bring different expectations. We want comprehensive information, explicit statements, answers spelled out clearly. But ancient texts work differently. They expect active readers, people who will gather clues, make connections, and draw conclusions based on the evidence provided. The text of Genesis provides that evidence. Sons and daughters born over centuries, populations growing, families spreading across the land. The framework exists for understanding who Cain's wife was and where she came from. We simply need to read with care, notice the details, and understand the conventions of ancient genealogical writing. The answer becomes clear when we pay attention to what the text actually says, when we stop reading modern assumptions into ancient words, and when we trust the narrative to provide the information we need, even if it comes in unexpected ways. The obvious answer: sisters and close kin. The straightforward reading of Genesis points to a simple conclusion. Cain married a sister or perhaps a niece, a close relative descended from Adam and Eve. This answer emerges naturally from the textual clues we have gathered. Adam and Eve had many sons and daughters. These children would have intermarried, as no other option existed in the earliest generations of humanity. For many modern readers, this conclusion creates immediate discomfort. Our societies forbid marriages between siblings. Our laws classify such unions as wrongful acts. Our biology warns of genetic dangers. The very thought feels wrong, triggering visceral reactions shaped by contemporary values and scientific knowledge. But we must understand the ancient context before applying modern judgments. The earliest humans faced a unique situation, one that would never be repeated in history. They stood at the absolute beginning of the human story, in a world where close kinship marriages were not merely permitted, but necessary for humanity's continuation. The biblical text shows no concern about these early marriages. No divine prohibition appears in Genesis. No moral commentary accompanies the unions. The narrative simply records that people married and had children, following the original command to be fruitful and multiply. The silence suggests that such arrangements in this specific context and time fell within acceptable bounds. Consider the timeline. Adam fathers Seth at age 130, but Cain and Abel were born earlier, perhaps decades before Seth. During those years and during the centuries that followed, Adam and Eve continued having children. By the time Cain reached adulthood, numerous siblings could have existed. By the time he journeyed to Nod, some of those siblings would have been adults themselves, capable of marriage and childbearing. Even if Cain left immediately after the confrontation with God, traveling alone to Nod, he would not remain isolated for long. Families expand, people migrate. His siblings and their children would spread across the land, some eventually reaching the same regions where Cain settled. The Earth's population, though small by later standards, would be mobile and growing. The ancient Near Eastern context provides additional perspective. In the world of the biblical patriarchs, kinship marriages were common and accepted. Abraham married his half-sister Sarah. Isaac married Rebekah, a close relative from his father's family line. Jacob married two sisters, Leah and Rachel, his cousins. These marriages occurred within extended family networks, maintaining tribal and clan connections. While these later examples involve more distant relatives than siblings, they demonstrate that close kin marriages held a different cultural meaning in ancient times. Family ties ensured trust, maintained property within the clan, and strengthened social bonds. The concern was not genetic, but communal, preserving identity and inheritance. The prohibition against close marriages appears later in biblical history. Leviticus 18, given through Moses, establishes clear boundaries. No man shall approach a close relative to uncover nakedness. The chapter lists forbidden relationships: mother, sister, daughter, aunt, and various in-law relationships. These laws create structure for a growing society, protecting family integrity and preventing abuse. But Genesis predates Leviticus by many generations. The patriarchs lived before the law, before these specific commands were given. What later became regulated was earlier left open, necessary for humanity's survival and expansion from a single original pair. The genetic concern that troubles modern readers deserves careful attention. Inbreeding today carries significant risks. When close relatives reproduce, recessive genetic disorders become more likely. Harmful mutations that normally remain hidden can express themselves, causing health problems in offspring. Modern genetics has documented these dangers thoroughly. However, the genetic situation of the first humans would have been fundamentally different. Adam and Eve, if created directly by God, as Genesis describes, would have possessed no genetic defects. Their DNA would have been pristine, without the accumulated mutations that build up over generations. No harmful recessive genes would lurk in their genetic code waiting to cause problems. As their children married each other, the risk we associate with inbreeding simply would not have existed. There were no genetic defects to compound, no mutations to concentrate. The genetic problems we observe in modern inbreeding scenarios result from thousands of generations of accumulated errors in DNA replication. The first generations had none of this baggage. Over time, as mutations naturally occurred through normal biological processes, the genetic landscape changed. Errors crept in, copying mistakes accumulated, environmental damage affected DNA. Eventually, close kin marriages would indeed become risky. The prohibition in Leviticus, appearing roughly 2,500 years after creation by traditional biblical chronology, comes at a point when genetic diversity has expanded and mutations have accumulated sufficiently that such regulations become wise. This progression makes biological sense. Start with a genetically pure population. Allow time for mutations to occur naturally. Eventually reach a point where close marriages concentrate those mutations dangerously, then establish laws to prevent it. The biblical timeline aligns with this biological progression. Population genetics also supports the idea of humanity beginning from a very small group. The concept of a genetic bottleneck describes situations where a population shrinks dramatically, then expands again from the survivors. During the bottleneck, genetic diversity decreases. Everyone descends from the few who survived. Close relationships become unavoidable. Whether the bottleneck came from a literal Adam and Eve or from a small founding population, the genetic effect is similar. close intermarriage becomes necessary. As long as the founding population was genetically healthy, and as long as the expansion happens relatively quickly, the population can recover and thrive. The biblical lifespans recorded in Genesis 5 aid this recovery. If people lived for centuries, each generation would overlap with many others. A single couple could personally witness their descendants to the 10th generation and beyond. Population growth accelerates when multiple generations reproduce simultaneously. What might take thousands of years with modern lifespans could happen in mere centuries with ancient lifespans. Some scholars suggest that the term sister in ancient texts sometimes carried broader meaning, referring to close relatives beyond literal siblings. In some contexts, sister could mean cousin or clan member. This interpretation would make Cain's wife a relative, but perhaps not quite as close as a full sister. The marriage would still be within the family of Adam and Eve's descendants, but with slightly more genetic separation. Whether Cain married a full sister, a half sister, or a niece makes little difference to the core answer. In any case, he married a close relative because close relatives were the only humans who existed. The relationship would have been recognized as kinship by any definition. The specific degree of relation matters less than the fundamental reality. All humans in that early period descended from Adam and Eve. This answer satisfies the textual evidence. It explains how Cain found a wife. It accounts for the population that could build cities. It resolves the mystery without requiring speculation about other human races or pre-existing peoples. The text tells us Adam and Eve had many children. Those children married each other. Civilization grew from there. The solution is straightforward. The answer also respects the cultural and biological contexts. What seems strange to modern sensibilities was practical necessity in humanity's first generations. What carries genetic risk today posed no such danger then. What later law forbade was earlier permitted. Understanding these contexts removes the scandal and shows the answer's reasonableness. The real question is not whether this answer is correct, but why it troubles us so deeply. Our reaction reveals more about our own cultural moment than about the ancient text. We bring assumptions about genetics, ethics, and social norms that the original audience did not share. Learning to read the text on its own terms, in its own context, allows us to see the answer that was always there, waiting for us to notice. Cain's wife was most likely his sister, perhaps a niece, certainly a close relative. She was a daughter or granddaughter of Adam and Eve, part of the expanding human family filling the earth as commanded. The text does not name her because her individual identity mattered less than the continuation of the human line. She represents the next generation, the living proof that humanity would survive despite sin, exile, and tragedy. Competing theories, pre-Adamites and other races. Not everyone accepts the straightforward answer. Throughout history, alternative theories have emerged, attempting to explain Cain's wife through different frameworks. These theories propose that other humans existed before, alongside, or separately from Adam and Eve. They imagine a world more populated than Genesis seems to suggest, with multiple human origins rather than a single source. The pre-Adamite theory stands as the most prominent alternative. This view proposes that God created other humans before Adam, or that Adam represented only one line of humanity among several. According to this theory, when Cain traveled to Nod, he encountered these pre-existing peoples and married one of their daughters. His fear of being hunted by "whoever finds me" makes more sense, advocates argue, if the world contained populations beyond his immediate family. This theory has ancient roots but gained particular traction in the 17th and 19th centuries. French theologian Isaac La Peyrère published a book in 1655 arguing for humans before Adam, using it to explain the existence of distant peoples newly encountered during the age of exploration. How could all humanity have descended from Adam if populations existed in lands unknown to the biblical world? Pre-Adamite theory offered an answer. The idea attracted those seeking to reconcile biblical accounts with emerging scientific and geographical knowledge. As explorers mapped new continents and encountered diverse peoples, questions arose about human origins and dispersal. Could all races have descended from a single pair living in ancient Mesopotamia? The time frame seemed too short, the distances too great. Pre-Adamite theory provided an alternative framework. Some versions of the theory suggested that Genesis chapter 1 describes a general creation of mankind, while chapter 2 narrows to focus on Adam as the father of a specific line, perhaps the Hebrews specifically. The people created in chapter 1, they argue, formed the broader human population. Adam, created in chapter 2, became the father of the chosen line through which salvation would come. This reading treats the two creation accounts as describing different events rather than the same event from different angles. The gap between chapters, these interpreters claim, holds space for pre-Adamite populations who lived, married, and built civilizations before Adam appeared on the scene. Cain, fleeing from his family, would have encountered these peoples and married among them. Another variant suggests that the land of Nod already contained inhabitants when Cain arrived. The name might refer to a region already settled by others. Cain did not find an empty wilderness, but an established territory with people who received him despite his exile status. His city building then becomes collaboration with these existing populations, rather than an achievement starting from scratch. The theory also points to Genesis chapter 6, where the sons of God take the daughters of men as wives, producing the Nephilim. Some interpret sons of God as Adam's line and daughters of men as descendants of pre-Adamite populations. This mixing of lines, they argue, corrupted humanity and necessitated the flood, wiping out all except Noah's family, who maintained pure Adamic descent. However, sons of God in Hebrew scripture typically refers to divine beings or angels, not human lineages. The passage more likely describes a mysterious union between heavenly beings and human women producing giant offspring. Using this obscure and debated passage to support pre-Adamite theory builds speculation upon speculation. More speculative theories venture even further. Some propose that God created multiple races separately, each adapted to their particular environments. This polygenesis view suggests independent human origins in different parts of the world. Adam's line becomes one among several, perhaps the line chosen for divine revelation but not the source of all humanity. This theory attempts to explain racial diversity without requiring all variations to evolve from a single source. Different skin colors, body types, and features would represent separate creative acts rather than environmental adaptations over time. Cain could have married someone from a different human race, accounting for the mystery of his wife's origin. Yet another approach focuses on the mark of Cain. God places a sign on him so that no one who finds him will strike him down. Some theories suggest this mark represented a visible racial characteristic, implying that Cain's descendants formed a distinct ethnic group. His wife, coming from a different race, would have contributed to this distinctiveness. The appeal of these theories is understandable. They resolve the discomfort with close kin marriage. They provide ready explanations for human diversity. They accommodate the sense that Genesis describes a more populated world than a single family could produce. They align with modern discomfort about inbreeding and ancient concerns about other peoples existing beyond the chosen line. But these theories face significant problems. Most fundamentally, they conflict with the clear statements of Genesis itself. Acts 17 records Paul declaring that God made from one man every nation of mankind to live on all the face of the earth. The New Testament affirms common descent, a single human origin. This theological point matters deeply for doctrines of sin and salvation, as we will explore further. The pre-Adamite theory also requires reading Genesis 1 and 2 as describing separate events when the text shows no indication of this. The literary shift between chapters reflects different perspectives on the same creation, not different creations. Chapter 2 fills in details that chapter 1 summarizes. They complement rather than contradict or supplement each other. Textual analysis reveals that Genesis 5 treats Adam as the first human, the beginning of the human line. This is the book of the generations of Adam, introduces the genealogy, tracing humanity's story from its source. If humans existed before Adam, we would expect some acknowledgement, some distinction between Adamites and pre-Adamites. The text provides none. The theory also fails to explain why God would create Adam specially if humans already existed. The garden narrative presents Adam as unique, the first to receive God's breath, the first to walk with God in Eden. This special creation loses meaning if Adam was merely one human among many already populating the earth. Geographic and linguistic evidence from the biblical text also argues against pre-Adamites. Genesis 11 describes humanity speaking one language until the Babel dispersion. If multiple races with separate origins existed, they would have developed different languages independently. The unified language at Babel suggests unified origin. The fear Cain expresses about being hunted does not require pre-Adamites to make sense. His own extended family, growing over years or decades, would have been sufficient cause for concern. Brothers, cousins, nephews, all might seek to avenge Abel. The fear acknowledges a spreading population, but that population need not come from a separate source. City building also does not demand pre-Adamite populations. Cities in the ancient world could be quite small, sometimes only a few hundred inhabitants. What we would call a village, ancient texts termed a city if it had walls and permanent structures. Cain's descendants alone, multiplying over generations, could establish such a settlement. The theories attempting to use Genesis 6's sons of God face the challenge that this passage appears long after Cain, describing events immediately before the flood. Chronologically, it cannot explain Cain's wife. Additionally, the passage describes an aberrant event, something going wrong rather than normal human reproduction. Building a theory of human origins on this strange text is questionable methodology. Polygenesis theories suggesting separate racial creations conflict with both biblical testimony and genetic evidence. DNA analysis traces all modern humans to common ancestors. Mitochondrial DNA passed through mothers and Y chromosomes passed through fathers both point to shared origins. Different races share too much genetic similarity to have separate origins. We are one family, variations on a theme rather than separate compositions. These alternative theories often arise from discomfort with the straightforward reading rather than from textual necessity. They solve a problem that may not exist, at least not in the way modern readers perceive it. The close kin marriage that troubles us was not problematic in its original context, as we have seen. The theories also tend to multiply mysteries rather than solve them. If pre-Adamites existed, where did they come from? How were they created? What happened to them? Why does the text never mention them directly? The theory raises more questions than it answers, violating the principle that simpler explanations are generally preferable. Some see these theories as attempts to preserve biblical authority while accommodating scientific or social concerns. But they actually undermine the text by reading into it what it does not say. Better to trust that the ancient writers knew what they were doing, that they told the story they intended to tell, and that the answer to our question lies within the text as given, rather than in elaborate theories imposing outside frameworks. The competing theories serve a purpose in our exploration. They show the range of thought on this question. They highlight the discomforts and concerns that drive people to seek alternatives to the plain reading. They demonstrate that thoughtful people throughout history have wrestled with this mystery, but ultimately, these theories lack the textual support and logical coherence of the straightforward answer. Cain married a relative because relatives were all who existed. No pre-Adamites populate Genesis. No separate races receive mention. No hidden populations lurk in the text's margins. The family of Adam and Eve, growing and spreading across the land, provides all the people necessary to explain everything Genesis describes. The theological implications, original sin, the image of God, and humanity. The question of Cain's wife reaches beyond historical curiosity into profound theological territory. How we answer shapes our understanding of human nature, sin, salvation, and unity. The implications ripple through core Christian doctrines, affecting how we read not just Genesis, but the entire biblical narrative. Start with the doctrine of original sin. Christianity traditionally teaches that sin entered the world through Adam's disobedience in the garden. Paul writes in Romans 5 that sin came into the world through one man and death through sin, and so death spread to all men because all sinned. This theology depends on universal human descent from Adam. If all humans trace their ancestry back to him, then all inherit the consequences of his choice. The sister-wife answer preserves this unity. Every human descends from Adam and Eve. Their story is our story. Their choice affects us because we carry their nature. Sin spread to everyone because everyone comes from the source where sin entered. The theology remains coherent and grounded in shared human origin, but pre-Adamite theory disrupts this framework. If other humans existed before Adam or alongside him, did they fall? Were they subject to the same command about the tree? Did sin spread to them through Adam's choice, or did they remain untouched by the garden events? The questions multiply rapidly. If pre-Adamites did not participate in the fall, they would be sinless, unfallen humans living alongside fallen Adamites. But Scripture knows nothing of this division. The entire human race stands under sin's power. Paul declares, "All have sinned and fall short of the glory of God." The universal scope of this statement requires universal descent from the one through whom sin entered. Some pre-Adamite proponents try to maintain unity by suggesting that Adam's sin somehow affected all humans, regardless of their origin. But this makes sin's transmission mysterious and arbitrary. Why should Adam's choice affect people not descended from him? The inheritance model that Paul uses, where children share their father's nature, only works if Adam is actually the father of all. The question also touches the image of God. Genesis declares that God created mankind in his image and likeness. This image bearing defines human dignity and worth. Every person reflects the divine image, making human life sacred and valuable. But what if some humans descended from Adam while others derived from separate origins? Do pre-Adamites bear God's image? If so, how and when did they receive it? Genesis 1 states that God created mankind in his image, but the context suggests a single creative act, not multiple parallel creations. If pre-Adamites lacked the divine image, they would be human in biology, but not in theological status. This creates a hierarchy that Scripture nowhere supports. The sister-wife answer avoids these complications. All humans descend from the pair created in God's image. The image passes naturally from parents to children through normal generation. Every person, regardless of race or origin, bears the same divine image because all trace back to the same source. Human unity and equality rest on common ancestry. Salvation theology also depends on human unity. Christ came as the second Adam, Paul teaches, reversing what the first Adam corrupted. Jesus represents humanity before God, standing in for the entire human race. His sacrifice covers all because he shares nature with all. He can be truly human because humanity has a single definition, a unified nature descending from Adam. But if multiple human origins exist, which humanity does Christ represent? Does his sacrifice cover pre-Adamites or only Adamites? The question becomes absurd when stated plainly, yet it follows logically from pre-Adamite theory. The gospel's universal scope requires that Christ is related to everyone he saves. Hebrews emphasizes that Jesus took on human nature to represent his brothers and sisters. Brotherhood requires shared ancestry. The genealogies that trace Jesus back to Adam gain meaning from unified descent. Luke's gospel traces Jesus through David, through Abraham, through Noah, all the way back to Adam, the Son of God. This genealogy establishes Jesus' place in human history, his connection to all who came before. If Adam fathered only one line among many, the genealogy becomes less significant, connecting Jesus to some humans but not all. The concept of federal headship also matters here. Theology speaks of Adam as the head of the human race, representing all his descendants. His choice bound them because he stood as their representative. Christ functions as a new head, a new representative whose choice brings life rather than death. This parallel structure requires that Adam actually headed all humanity, not just a portion of it. Monogenism versus polygenism becomes the technical distinction. Monogenism teaches single origin, all humans from one source. Polygenism proposes multiple origins, separate human lines. Christianity has historically affirmed monogenism because polygenism undermines core doctrines. The unity of humanity matters theologically, not just historically. This unity also shapes ethics and human relations. If all humans descend from a single pair, then all humans are literally family. The command to love your neighbor gains depth when you recognize that every neighbor is a distant cousin, sharing your ancestry and nature. Racism loses any foundation when all racial groups trace back to the same source. We are one human family, variations within a unity rather than separate kinds. The sister-wife answer supports this unity. The marriage of close relatives in the first generations ensured that all subsequent humans would share tight genetic and familial bonds. There are no separate races in the sense of distinct species or origins. Every human carries the same fundamental nature because every human comes from the same trunk, even if we now spread across many branches. Pre-Adamite theory, by contrast, can enable racist thinking. If different populations have different origins, perhaps they have different natures, different worth, different destinies. History shows that polygynous ideas have been used to justify oppression and discrimination. While not all pre-Adamite proponents intend such conclusions, the theory opens doors that monogenism keeps closed. The timing of law regarding marriage also carries theological weight. God gave the prohibition against close kin marriage through Moses, centuries after the first generations. This suggests that such unions were acceptable in earlier periods but became inappropriate once population and genetic diversity increased. God's laws adapt to circumstances while maintaining consistent moral principles. This progressive revelation fits a theological pattern. God did not give all his commands at once, but revealed his will gradually, suited to humanity's situation and capacity. Early generations lived under general principles. Later generations received more specific regulations. The Mosaic Law represented a particular covenant for a particular people at a particular time. Some of its commands apply universally, others specifically. Marriage regulations fall partly in the category of situational commands. The core principle remains constant. Marriage should be faithful, fruitful, and follow proper boundaries. But what boundaries are proper depends on circumstances. When humanity was small, survival required flexibility. When humanity grew large, genetic health required restrictions. The changing law reflects changing conditions, not changing moral truth. This framework allows us to read Genesis without imposing later standards. We need not be scandalized that early humans married relatives when that was their only option. Nor need we conclude that such marriages would be acceptable now when many other options exist. Context matters. God's wisdom accommodates human circumstances while guiding toward his purposes. The theological significance of Cain's wife extends to questions of providence and redemption. Even in exile, even after wickedness, even in a strange land, Cain finds a wife and builds a family. Grace operates even in judgment. The human story continues despite sin. God's original blessing remains partly in effect. Be fruitful, multiply, fill the earth. Cain's descendants show humanity's resilience and God's ongoing care. Yet Cain's line also shows sin's progression. His descendant Lamech becomes the first recorded polygamist, taking 2 wives. He boasts of revenge, threatening to repay any slight 77 times. The line moves away from God, developing technology and culture, but not righteousness. The genealogy traces both human achievement and human corruption. Meanwhile, Seth's line, born to replace righteous Abel, walks a different path. Through Seth comes Enosh, and in Enosh's time, people begin to call on the name of the Lord. This line maintains relationship with God, eventually producing Noah, through whom humanity gets a fresh start after the flood. These 2 lines, Cain's and Seth's, both descend from Adam. Both show human nature's capacity for good and evil. Both demonstrate that humanity's story involves choices, not just origins. Theology must account for both the unity of human nature and the diversity of human choices. All start from the same place, but not all end in the same place. The answer to Cain's wife question thus shapes how we understand human nature itself. Are we unified or divided? Do we share essential nature, or do fundamental differences separate us? The sister-wife answer affirms unity while acknowledging diversity. We share origins, nature, and destiny. Yet within that unity, we make choices that lead different directions. The theological stakes are high. Get the origin story wrong, and you might get the salvation story wrong too. Understand that all humanity forms one family from one source, and you grasp why Christ's work can cover all. See that sin entered through one representative, and you understand why grace comes through another representative. Recognize human unity, and you have grounds for human dignity, equality, and brotherhood. These are not abstract theological puzzles, but truths that shape how we live, how we treat others, how we understand ourselves. The woman who married Cain, unnamed and undescribed, stands at a pivotal point in the human story. Through her, Cain's line continued. Through her example, we see the interweaving of all human lives into one great family tree. Her identity matters less than what she represents. The ongoing human story, complex and troubled but always held within God's sovereign purpose. The historical and cultural lens, how different eras answered the question. The question of Cain's wife has received different answers across the centuries, each era bringing its own concerns and perspectives to the ancient text. How people answered often reveals as much about their time as about the biblical narrative itself. The history of interpretation forms its own fascinating story. The early church fathers approached the question with relative simplicity. Holding firmly to monogenism, they generally accepted that Cain married a sister or close relative. Augustine, writing in the late 4th century, addressed the issue directly in The City of God. He explained that necessity required the first brothers to marry their sisters, as no other women existed. He saw no moral difficulty in this, given the unique circumstances. Augustine emphasized that what later became forbidden was earlier required. The law prohibiting such marriages came through Moses, but Moses lived long after these events. Different times called for different practices. The important point for Augustine was maintaining that all humans descended from Adam and Eve, preserving the theological unity necessary for understanding sin and salvation. Other early writers echoed this view. They spent little energy on the question, treating it as straightforward. Their commentaries moved quickly past Cain's marriage, focusing instead on the theological implications of his exile and the development of his line. The wife herself merited little attention beyond acknowledging she must have been a relative. The medieval period continued this tradition, but with added layers of interpretation. Medieval scholars loved allegory and typology, finding spiritual meanings beneath the literal text. Some saw Cain's wife as representing the church, joined to sinful humanity, yet producing spiritual offspring. Others developed elaborate theories about her name and nature, drawing connections to other biblical figures. But even with their allegorical tendencies, medieval interpreters maintained the literal answer that Cain married a relative. Thomas Aquinas, the great theological synthesizer, affirmed this view in his writings. He explained the biological and moral dimensions, arguing that early generations faced different circumstances than later ones. His systematic approach helped establish this interpretation as standard. Then came the age of exploration, and the question gained new urgency. European sailors encountered peoples in the Americas, Africa, and distant Pacific islands. These populations had lived isolated from the known world, developing distinct cultures and appearances. How could all humans descend from Adam if such vast differences existed? How had these peoples reached their lands? When did they separate from the biblical line? Pre-Adamite theory gained traction during this period as an attempted solution. Isaac Le Peyrer's 1655 work, Pre-Adamite, proposed that the men created in Genesis 1 were distinct from Adam, created in Genesis 2. This allowed for multiple human origins, explaining the diverse peoples explorers encountered. The theory sparked immediate controversy, earning Le Peyrer condemnation from both Catholic and Protestant authorities. Yet the idea persisted, appealing to those seeking to reconcile biblical accounts with geographical discoveries. Some used it to argue for the superiority of Adam's line, claiming that Europeans descended from the special creation, while other races came from pre-Adamites. This racist application shows how even biblical interpretation can be twisted to serve cultural prejudices. The Enlightenment brought new challenges. Philosophers questioned traditional authorities, including biblical narratives. They applied rationalist critique to Scripture, demanding answers that satisfied reason rather than faith. The question of Cain's wife became ammunition for skeptics who saw it as an obvious problem in the biblical account. Voltaire and others pointed to the mystery as evidence that the Bible could not be taken literally. How could Cain find a wife if only 4 humans existed? They rejected the sister-wife answer as morally repugnant and the pre-Adamite theory as lacking biblical support. For them, the question demonstrated that Genesis was mythology, not history. Christian apologists responded by carefully explaining the textual evidence for other children of Adam and Eve. They emphasized the cultural context and defended the biological feasibility of early close-kin marriages. The debate sharpened interpretive methods on both sides, forcing more careful reading of the text and more thorough engagement with objections. The 19th century brought evolutionary theory, dramatically changing the conversation. Darwin's Origin of Species proposed natural selection as a mechanism for the diversity of life. Applied to humans, this suggested we evolved from earlier species over vast time periods. The question of Cain's wife became entangled with debates about evolution, creation, and the historicity of Genesis. Some Christians attempted to harmonize evolution with Genesis, proposing that Adam represented the point where God gave souls or special revelation to previously existing hominids. Cain would then have married one of these ensouled humans, descended from the same evolutionary line, but not necessarily from Adam himself. This approach tried to maintain theological unity while accommodating scientific findings. Other Christians rejected evolution entirely, defending a literal six-day creation and young Earth chronology. For them, the sister-wife answer remained the obvious and only biblically faithful option. They saw compromise with evolutionary theory as dangerous, undermining scriptural authority and doctrinal foundations. The 20th century added genetic science to the mix. Discovery of DNA and subsequent mapping of human genetics provided new tools for understanding human origins. Genetic studies traced human ancestry, identified migration patterns, and estimated population sizes at different points in history. This data entered the conversation about Adam, Eve, and human origins. Some geneticists argued that human genetic diversity requires we descended from a population of at least several thousand individuals, not a single pair. This challenged traditional interpretations. Others responded that genetic diversity could arise quickly through mutations, or that a literal Adam and Eve represented a bottleneck that genetic analysis might not detect so far back in time. More recent work on mitochondrial DNA and Y chromosomes has shown that all modern humans trace back to common ancestors, sometimes called mitochondrial Eve and Y chromosomal Adam. While these scientific figures lived at different times and were not a literal couple, their existence shows that human ancestry converges toward fewer individuals as you trace backward. This provides some support for the idea of descent from a small founding population. Different Christian traditions have maintained different emphases throughout this history. Roman Catholic teaching has consistently affirmed monogenism as necessary for the doctrine of original sin. The Church has been cautious about interpretations that compromise human unity. Protestant traditions show more diversity, with some maintaining strict literal readings and others allowing more flexible approaches. Jewish interpretation also has its own history with this question. Ancient rabbinical sources accepted that Cain married a sister, often adding traditions about her name and character. The Talmud and other Jewish texts expand on Genesis, filling gaps with stories that became part of Jewish tradition, even if not canonical scripture. These traditions show how communities elaborate on biblical narratives to answer persistent questions. Orthodox Christianity, maintaining strong connections to the Church Fathers, has largely continued their interpretive approach. The sister-wife answer remains standard, with emphasis on the theological importance of unified descent from Adam. Orthodox writers tend to be less concerned with harmonizing Genesis with modern science, focusing instead on preserving traditional understanding. What this historical survey reveals is that the sister-wife answer has been dominant across most of Christian history. Pre-Adamite and other alternative theories emerged as responses to specific historical challenges, but never replaced the traditional view in mainstream theology. When the question received sustained attention, the straightforward reading of Genesis, as describing close kin marriages in early generations, has won out. The various eras show us different concerns. Ancient readers worried about theology and moral coherence. Medieval thinkers added layers of spiritual meaning. Explorers and Enlightenment philosophers questioned human unity and biblical reliability. Modern readers grapple with genetics and evolution. Each age brings its questions to the text, and the text yields answers suited to those questions. But beneath the changing concerns, the basic facts remain constant. Genesis describes Adam and Eve having many children. Those children would have married each other. Cain found a wife among his extended family. The narrative records this without concern because the original audience understood these dynamics. Our challenge is not to make the text say something new, but to recover what it always said, reading with eyes trained by both careful study and historical awareness. The history of interpretation teaches humility. We are not the first to ask these questions. Brilliant minds across millennia have engaged this text. We stand on their shoulders, benefiting from their insights, while also able to see their limitations. Our own answers will likewise be both helpful and limited, serving our time while future generations bring new questions and perspectives. The scientific perspective: genetics, anthropology, and a human bottleneck. Modern science offers tools that ancient readers could never have imagined. We can analyze DNA, trace genetic markers across populations, map human migration patterns, and estimate when different groups diverged. This scientific data intersects with the biblical narrative in complex ways, sometimes supporting, sometimes challenging traditional interpretations. Start with human genetic diversity. When geneticists examine DNA across populations worldwide, they find remarkable similarity. Any two humans share about 99.9% of their DNA. The differences that create racial variations occupy a tiny fraction of our genome. This profound similarity points to recent common ancestry in evolutionary terms. Genetic studies also show that humans have less genetic diversity than many other species. Chimpanzees, though far fewer in number than humans, show greater genetic variation across their populations. This suggests humans passed through a genetic bottleneck, a period when our population shrank dramatically, reducing diversity. The survivors of this bottleneck became ancestors to all modern humans. The bottleneck concept aligns interestingly with biblical narrative. Whether the bottleneck was Adam and Eve, Noah's family, or some other event, the genetic evidence indicates that all modern humans descend from a relatively small ancestral group. The debate centers on timing and numbers, not on whether such convergence occurred. Mitochondrial DNA provides one line of evidence. This genetic material passes from mothers to children largely unchanged, accumulating mutations slowly over time. By comparing mitochondrial DNA across populations and calculating mutation rates, scientists can estimate when different groups shared a common maternal ancestor. This analysis points to a woman who lived roughly 150,000 to 200,000 years ago, sometimes called mitochondrial Eve. Important clarification: mitochondrial Eve was not the only woman alive at her time. She simply represents the woman from whom all modern mitochondrial DNA descends. Other women lived alongside her, but their mitochondrial lines eventually died out, having only sons in some generation who could not pass on mitochondrial DNA. Mitochondrial Eve's line alone survived to the present through an unbroken chain of daughters. Y chromosome analysis provides a parallel line. This genetic material passes from fathers to sons. Similar analysis traces all modern Y chromosomes back to a man who'd roughly 200,000 to 300,000 years ago, sometimes termed Y chromosomal Adam. Again, he was not the only man alive, but the one whose Y chromosome line survived while others died out. These two figures did not live at the same time and were not a couple. The names mitochondrial Eve and Y chromosomal Adam unfortunately create confusion by echoing the biblical names. They represent points of genetic convergence, not literal first parents. Their existence does show that tracing backward leads to fewer ancestors, but the timescales and mechanisms differ from traditional biblical chronology. The genetic data also reveals human migration patterns. After emerging in Africa, humans spread across the globe in waves. Different populations carry genetic markers indicating when they split from other groups. The pattern shows branching and movement, populations dividing and moving into new territories over tens of thousands of years. These migration patterns raise questions about biblical chronology. Traditional calculations place Adam around 6,000 to 10,000 years ago. Genetic evidence suggests humans spread across the globe much earlier. How do we reconcile these timelines? Several approaches have been proposed. Some Christians maintain young Earth chronology, arguing that genetic mutation rates are not constant and that dating methods carry assumptions that may not hold. They suggest the appearance of age, rapid diversification after creation, or other mechanisms that would compress the timeline. This approach preserves literal Genesis reading at the cost of rejecting mainstream scientific consensus. Others accept ancient dates while reinterpreting Genesis. Perhaps the genealogies in Genesis contain gaps, with son of sometimes meaning descendant of. This would push Adam further back in time. Or perhaps Adam represents the point when God gave spiritual awareness to previously existing humans, making him the first spiritually alive human rather than the first biological human. This preserves evolutionary science while maintaining theological themes. A third group sees Genesis as theological narrative rather than scientific history. They argue the text aims to teach spiritual truths about God, humanity, and sin, not to provide scientific data about origins. The story of Adam and Eve communicates that humans are created by God, that we fell into sin, and that we need redemption. Whether these events happened literally as described matters less than the theological truths they convey. Each approach has advocates and critics. The debate reveals tension between reading ancient texts on their own terms and integrating modern knowledge. How much should science inform biblical interpretation? How much should biblical interpretation constrain scientific conclusions? These questions extend far beyond Cain's wife to the entire conversation about faith and science. Population genetics adds another dimension. Some studies suggest that human genetic diversity requires we descended from a population of at least 10,000 individuals, never dropping below that threshold. If accurate, this challenges the idea of descent from a single couple. However, other geneticists dispute these calculations, arguing that bottlenecks can be more severe than the diversity suggests, especially if followed by rapid expansion. The debate gets technical quickly, involving mathematical models, assumptions about mutation rates, selection pressures, and population dynamics. Non-specialists struggle to evaluate competing claims. What seems clear is that genetic data does not definitively rule out descent from a small founding population, but it makes such descent more complex than a simple reading of Genesis might suggest. Anthropology contributes additional perspectives. Fossil evidence shows that modern humans emerged in Africa and spread from there, but other human species existed for long periods, including Neanderthals and Denisovans. Modern humans carry small amounts of DNA from these other species, indicating some interbreeding occurred. How do these other human species fit into the Genesis narrative? Were they pre-Adamites, descended from Adam but different branches, entirely separate from the biblical story? These questions show how scientific discoveries raise new interpretive challenges. The authors of Genesis knew nothing of Neanderthals or DNA. They wrote from their cultural context, addressing their audience's questions. We must be careful not to fault ancient texts for not answering modern questions they never intended to address. Yet the biblical claim of human unity remains relevant. Despite encountering diverse peoples, despite mapping genetic variations, despite discovering extinct human relatives, science continues to affirm that modern humans form one family. We are all related, all connected, all descended from common ancestors, whether recent or ancient. This scientific finding resonates with biblical teaching about human unity and kinship. The genetic evidence for close relationships in human ancestry also speaks to our question. If humans passed through bottlenecks, if populations were sometimes small, then close kin marriages would have been unavoidable. Whether the bottleneck was Adam and Eve or some other event, biology and genetics show that human populations can recover from very small numbers and that close reproduction is sometimes necessary for survival. Studies of genetic disorders also inform the discussion. Harmful recessive genes become problems when close relatives reproduce because both partners might carry the same mutation. But these mutations accumulate over time. A newly created or very early population would have few such mutations. Close marriages would be less risky in early generations than in later ones, when mutations have had time to accumulate. This genetic reality fits the biblical pattern we noted earlier. Close marriages were acceptable in early generations, but forbidden later. As mutations accumulated, the risk increased, making prohibitions wise. The biological progression matches the textual progression from permission to prohibition. Modern science cannot prove or disprove the biblical account definitively. Science deals with natural processes and material evidence. The Bible makes claims about divine action, purposes, and meanings that lie partly outside scientific investigation. But science can inform our reading, helping us understand what is biologically possible, what the physical evidence suggests, and where different interpretations align or conflict with material reality. The sister-wife answer aligns well with genetic findings about human unity, bottlenecks, and recent common ancestry. It explains how humanity could expand from a small beginning. It accounts for the genetic similarity across populations. It fits the evidence that close relationships marked human ancestry at some point. While scientific timelines and biblical chronologies may not match precisely, the broad pattern of human origins from a small group finds support in both accounts. Science reminds us that the question of Cain's wife is not merely ancient history, but touches on who we are today. Every human alive carries genetic evidence of our shared past. We are related to each other, linked through invisible threads of DNA stretching back through countless generations. Understanding our origins, whether through genesis or genetics or both, helps us understand ourselves and our place in the grand human story. Beyond the mystery, why the question matters today. We have traveled through Genesis, examined competing theories, explored theological implications, surveyed historical interpretations, and considered scientific perspectives. The evidence points consistently toward the straightforward answer. Cain married a close relative, most likely a sister or niece, descended from Adam and Eve. This answer satisfies the textual clues, respects the ancient context, and aligns with both theology and genetics. But having answered the question, we must ask a deeper one. Why does this matter? Who cares about the identity of Cain's wife, a woman who lived thousands of years ago, whose name we do not even know? What significance does this ancient mystery hold for us today? The question matters because it touches something fundamental about human identity. When we ask who Cain married, we are really asking who we are. Are we one family or many? Do we share essential nature, or are we fundamentally divided? The answer shapes how we see each other, how we treat strangers, and how we understand our obligations to distant peoples. The sister-wife answer affirms human unity in the deepest sense. Every person you meet, no matter how different they seem, shares your ancestry. We all trace back to the same source. This is not merely poetic sentiment, but biological and theological reality. We are cousins, however distant, branches on the same family tree. This truth carries moral weight. When Scripture commands us to love our neighbor, it is not asking us to love strangers. In the deepest sense, there are no strangers. Every neighbor is family, connected to you through chains of descent that reach back to common ancestors. The command to love becomes a call to recognize kinship, to treat all humans as the brothers and sisters they actually are. This reality confronts racism at its root. Racial differences are real but superficial, variations within a unified humanity rather than divisions between separate types. All racial groups share the same origin, the same nature, the same ancestors. No race can claim superiority because all races come from the same place. The visible differences that people have used to justify oppression and hatred are truly skin deep, minor variations in a shared genome. The question also speaks to human dignity. If all people bear God's image and all descend from the ones originally created in that image, then every human life carries infinite worth. There are no lesser humans, no people groups that matter less, no individuals whose suffering can be dismissed. The image of God marks every face from every race in every place. This understanding shapes ethics and politics. How should nations treat refugees and immigrants? How should societies address inequality? How should individuals respond to human need? The answer begins with recognition that we are all family. What we do to the least of these, we do to our own relatives. The binding force is not merely moral command, but actual kinship. The question also illuminates how we read Scripture. The Bible is an ancient text written in specific cultural contexts to particular audiences. Understanding those contexts helps us read accurately. We must not impose modern sensibilities on ancient narratives or fault ancient writers for not addressing modern concerns. At the same time, Scripture speaks truth that transcends its immediate context, truth that addresses every age. Learning to hold both realities together, reading texts in their context while hearing their timeless message, becomes crucial. The story of Cain's wife teaches this balance. We understand that close marriages were necessary in early generations without concluding they are acceptable now. We recognize cultural difference without losing universal truth. We read with both historical awareness and contemporary application. The mystery also reminds us to read carefully and think deeply. Quick readings miss details, casual approaches overlook clues. The answer to Cain's wife was always in the text, but finding it required paying attention to genealogies, noting the mention of other children, understanding ancient literary conventions. Many mysteries that seem to challenge Scripture actually have answers waiting for careful readers to find them. This encourages humility. When we encounter something in the Bible that puzzles us, we should not immediately conclude the text is wrong or contradictory. Perhaps we have missed something. Perhaps we need more context. Perhaps the answer requires careful study and patient thought. The long history of biblical interpretation shows that questions that once seemed impossible to answer have yielded to persistent, faithful reading. The question also reveals how theology and science can inform each other. Genesis makes theological claims about human origins, nature, and purpose. Science investigates the physical mechanisms, the genetic patterns, the material evidence. Both perspectives offer valuable insights. Neither alone tells the complete story. Learning to integrate faith and reason, revelation and investigation becomes part of mature understanding. This integration does not mean forcing agreement where real conflicts exist. Sometimes biblical claims and scientific conclusions genuinely contradict, requiring us to evaluate evidence and make choices about what we believe. But more often, apparent conflicts dissolve when we understand texts properly and interpret data carefully. The question of human origins shows this dynamic. Both Genesis and genetics point to human unity, common ancestry, and relatively recent emergence of modern humanity, even if they use different languages and focus on different aspects. The unnamed wife of Cain represents something larger than herself. She stands for all the people whose stories go untold, whose names we never learn, whose lives seem insignificant in the grand narrative. Yet her marriage mattered. Through her, Cain's line continued. Through her, part of human history unfolded. She reminds us that every person plays a role, even those who never get recognition. This has pastoral significance. Most people feel unimportant, lost in the crowd, convinced their lives do not matter. But the story of humanity includes every individual. Each person descends from those early generations. Each carries forward the human story. Each matters to God and to the ongoing drama of history. The unnamed wife of Cain matters because every person matters, named or unnamed, remembered or forgotten. The question also connects to hope. Despite sin, despite exile, despite tragedy, the human story continued. Cain found a wife. Children were born. Cities were built. Life went on. This pattern repeats throughout Genesis and beyond. Humans fail, suffer consequences, yet receive grace to continue. God's purposes advance despite human rebellion. The wife of Cain testifies to this persistence, this stubborn continuation of life, even in darkness. Finally, the question invites wonder. After thousands of years, we can still ask and answer questions about the earliest humans. We can read their stories, trace their genealogies, understand their context. The ancient past connects to the present through chains of descent and transmission. We are not cut off from our origins, but connected to them through both physical ancestry and textual inheritance. Standing at the end of our exploration, we see that the mystery of Cain's wife opens into larger mysteries. Who are we? Where did we come from? How should we treat each other? What does it mean to be human? These questions matter far more than the identity of one ancient woman. Yet she helps us answer them, standing at a crucial point in the human story, reminding us of our shared origins and common nature. The answer to our question is straightforward. Cain married a relative, part of the expanding family of Adam and Eve. But the significance of that answer reaches forward through all of human history, touching every person alive today. We are one family, one humanity, one story. Understanding our origins helps us understand ourselves and each other, seeing in every face an echo of that original image, bearing witness to our common source and shared destiny. This is why the question matters. This is why we ask and seek and study. not merely to satisfy curiosity or resolve ancient puzzles, but to understand who we are, where we came from, and how we should live in light of our shared human story. The wife of Cain, unnamed but not unimportant, stands as a sign of that story, pointing us back to our beginnings and forward to our calling as one human family under God.